Hi, I'm Ben,
And I'm Ernie.
and this is Budget Nerds.
What was all in your mind?
You are not alone.
That is right. And not only are you not alone, but you are not alone.
Yes.
You are not a student loan, a LOAN loan. It's kind of a visual joke, but you get it, right? You get what we're saying. It's a loan.
I love it.
Yeah. What would Budget Nerds do without a little dad joke? But why are we talking about this? Well, because we're talking about college students today. We want to talk about just a little financial advice for people in college. And what are we talking about specifically? Because there's a lot of kinds of college students these days. Like there's people that are at middle age going back to college a lot now. Are we talking about like the stereotypical college student here, Ernie?
Yeah, the stereotypical college student, where basically college is your full-time job. You maybe work a summer job, have a part-time job during the school year, but primarily you're going to school and you don't have that full-time income at this point in your life.
Yeah, and it's good to talk about because a lot of the advice that we give kind of assumes you have like a regular income, you have regular expenses, you're full-fledged adult, I guess you could say. But when you're in college and you're younger and you're a full-time student, you might not have that steady income. It might be a little more variable. And your expenses, you might have fewer expenses because you're paying for things up front, or you're getting help, or you have student loans or something like that. So the financial advice and budgeting is a little different when you're a college student. So I think we can talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely. And the way we're going to do that is just kind of talking to our younger selves, right? Going back to our college days, remembering those glorious moments.
Yeah. And I think it'll be just a good discussion to have. And as I'm sure a lot of people watching, you might be a college student yourself, or you might be teaching people who are going to college. If you have some kids they're growing up and getting ready to leave the home and be on their own. So yeah, there's a lot to discuss here. So when were you in college, Ernie? Let's date you here.
1997. Fall of 1997 is when I arrived on campus as a freshman. Feels like ages ago. I mean, we're talking, I think that was the beginning of Backstreet Boys. Britney Spears was about ready to break onto the scene. Titanic was huge. Our clothes were huge. I think all my shirts and pants were just extremely baggy. So it was a very interesting time. And I have some very distinct memories about money in college. One, I remember as soon as I arrived in town, setting up a savings and checking account at the local credit union. I mean, I remember going into the building, standing in line, and just transferring my money from my local credit union to this new credit union.
Couldn't you just do that on your phone, Ernie, like in 1997?
What's a phone?
Why'd you have to go?
That rotary, dial them up?
Yeah, right.
No.
You actually literally had to go to the credit union?
Go to the credit union.
Go there?
I mean, we had email, but barely. No cell phones, no Facebook. Yeah, definitely different times. And so I think my relationship with money was, I remember it's tough to label it, but I do remember being a little bit scared of credit card debt. I don't know if that's something that my parents put in my head or some college advisors, but I just knew, I don't want to, open a credit card and then just go into a ton of debt. So I had that particular fear, but other than that, and just a few memories of, setting up that account or having a little bit of spending money, I didn't really think about money a whole lot in college. How about you?
Yeah. Well, for me, it was exactly 10 years later than you, 2007.
Wow.
I went to college.
That's a completely different world.
Yeah, it is. We took the baggy jeans and we had skinny jeans. Coldplay, financial crisis brewing, very first iPhones coming out, Britney Spears having a breakdown. The 300 movie, I don't know. Those are things that I looked up on the internet too before now. I don't know what was going. I don't remember what was going on then. But Facebook was like just starting. In fact, I remember when I decided which college I was going to, I created a Facebook, and it had like literally just started like a year before. So that's the world we're looking at here, like the beginning of kind of the modern social media technology happening around then. And yeah, I worked in college part-time, so I had some income coming in, and I worked a lot. I worked full-time in the summers. Definitely wasn't enough to cover tuition, but it covered my, most of my living expenses and stuff like that. Yeah, I'd say like my relationship with money, my parents did instill a lot of like kind of just keeping on top of things, and like just kind of like paying bills on time. Just like, they were always a really good example to me in that. But I think basically my method for handling money was have like an arbitrary number that I want my checking account to be at, and just don't go below that. That was basically how I handled money. And, it worked okay for me. I did have a lot of privilege because I had a lot of help from my parents, and most of my expenses were covered, but I had some things that I was responsible for too. And yeah, it worked fine. But I think there's some things that I might have actually even missed out on because I did have a little bit of fear around money. Like I was a little worried about spending, or maybe more worried than I even should have been sometimes, because I didn't have a budget. I didn't have like assurance that I could spend money. I never really knew if I could afford something.
That's interesting.
You know what I mean? So yeah, that's what I think about in college. I was never like afraid. Like, I don't think I was like gripped by fear around money, but I do think maybe I let some opportunities pass me by because I didn't know if I could afford something. You know what I mean?
Okay.
So,
well, let's get into kind of some, practical advice, I guess, for about what we can share with college students. I think first thing to deal with is inflows, right? Whether it's the summer job or that financial aid check, maybe it's a part-time job, or even, those regular checks from parents or grandparents to help you out along the way, right? How do you deal with that income? I think
so many college students say like, oh, I can't budget because I don't have a regular income, or they maybe even think if they're getting help from parents or something, they don't even think that they make any money at all. But like, those are inflows just like if from a job or something like that. So you need to treat them really like a paycheck almost, and plan for that. So basically what we're saying is you need a budget, right?
Because a budget is a plan. And that's what I didn't have in college. So, similar to you, I worked in the summer, saved up that money, and then that was my money, along with, help from my parents, and then an occasional part-time job in my later years in college. But that was the money then to get me through the entire year. And it just kind of sat there in my checking account. In fact, I remember one summer, I made a lot of money, and most of it was for rent, but I was scared to death that I was going to spend that money and not be able to make rent some months. So what I did in September was I cut my landlord a check for like $3,000. And I said, oh, wow, here's the next year's worth of rent.
Right.
Now that just makes me cringe looking back on that, because I'm like, man.
Well, because you didn't have a way to trust yourself. You needed to put in something to make sure you paid that
rent.
Right.
And interest rates were a lot higher back then. I could have kept that money, just made a little something off it, because it would have been protected in my plan. But anyways.
Right. Yeah. So basically what we're saying is you need to plan. And I think so many people think that they can't plan because their income isn't regular. But I think with YNAB, because you're not making a budget necessarily based on what you expect your income to be. You're basing it on what you have right now. It can be a lot easier to make a plan with that kind of a allocation system rather than forecasting,
Absolutely.
So what does that mean? Like, so say like let's do like an example. I remember, a couple weeks into college, everybody would get their big student loan disbursements, because, I went to college in 2007. That was the beginning of like the big time student loan, that was the beginning of the crisis, right? Right. And but I remember seeing my dorm mates, and I was shaking my head at the time too, because I was just like, guys, this is not good. They would, they get that disbursement, and they were like, oh, maybe some of them weren't even expecting it, and they went out and they bought some, like an Xbox and stuff like that. And I'm like, guys, this is going to have to last you for a while. And, it's funny because like when you're on campus, we had like we had a meal plan, like meals were paid for by when you paid tuition, you paid for meal plan or by a student loan. And so I think a lot of kids would like get that money and they're not planning on doing a whole lot of stuff off campus. So they're just like, well, I got all this like cash, I can spend it on whatever, not really fully understanding that they're going to have to pay that back. And thus we have the beginning of the student loan crisis. So there you go. But what you can do, like if you get that disbursement is, with YNAB, you can plan ahead. I would actually, I don't know how you handle this, Ernie. If I were if I were using YNAB in college and I got like a big chunk of money, or maybe like a bunch of money from working in the summer, I would go ahead and budget ahead for the whole semester.
You'd go into the actual month. So October assigned dollars, November assigned dollars.
Yeah, there are some practical stuff, like it'd be a little bit harder to change the budget because you'd have to like click forward.
Sure.
But I think it would make me feel really secure to be able to look and actually see that those expenses all the way till December, or maybe even for the whole year, were covered. And you wouldn't have to like do what you did, like pay your landlord up front because you'd have it covered. Yeah. Right. How would you handle it if you were to get like a student loan disbursement at the
I would do the holding category.
That need to last you.
Right. I would have a category and just dump all my income in that category. Then basically every month pay myself a salary. Mm-hmm. So I arrived on campus in September. I take care of September expenses. Then I've got this large amount of cash in, I'd probably call it something like next month. And then in October, I'd basically figure out, okay, how long can this get me? Or can this get me through 9 months? And how much is that per month? And then just pay myself that every single month.
So really, there's like two ways you can do it. You can either go ahead and plan with the money you have for the whole semester, or you could kind of give yourself an income by like kind of allowing yourself to plan with a certain amount of that money every month, right? So, which I think
the downside of using that holding category when you're in college is, right, you're always looking at this large amount of money thinking, oh, spring break.
It might be a little tempting to go crazy.
There does have to be some self-discipline there, like, and just knowing I'm not touching those until I pay myself in that next month.
Yeah. So maybe it depends on your personality a little bit, and what would give you more security. I think it's a good way to do it.
And then, of course, if I was supplementing that income with a part-time job or money from parents, whatever the case may be, I would just probably assign those dollars in the month that I received them. Or if I didn't need them there, I would push them to that next month.
That's interesting. Yeah. It's interesting because, let's go like the other end of life of adulthood. I'm like helping my parents right now. We've been having lots of conversations about budgeting because they've started using YNAB because they just retired. And they're kind of looking at that too. Like, how do we, like, they have some savings that they're living on right now until they can get some pensions that will be coming in later on. Anyways, details. And they're like, should we plan ahead with that? Or should, and I told them, I was like, I think you should do that. You should kind of give yourself a salary every month. Because I think that you're used to living on a salary. So you could just kind of give yourself a salary out of your savings. That could be a good way to do it.
Right. Because that's what we're used to. Like you said, that's a good way to approach it.
Right. It's kind of interesting. There's actually like a lot of parallels between those two stages of life. Because if you're not working, you're like a regular salary job, you're not getting that regular income. Instead, you're living off of a big chunk all at once, and kind of dealing with that. So, yeah, maybe there's a blog post there or something. Similarities between college and retirees,
There we go. Fire it up.
I don't know.
All right, we talked about inflows. So the money that we have, let's talk about the other side of that equation, the spending. Okay, because I think, especially in college, right, that question is always, can I afford this? Can I afford, to go on spring break? Can I afford to buy some new clothes? Whatever the case may be. Okay, how do we kind of gauge that?
Yeah, and it's different from when you are an adult, a full-fledged adult, I guess, whatever you want to call it, working a regular job with regular expenses, because your expenses are going to be a little different if you're kind of that stereotypical college student, maybe living on campus on a meal plan, You don't have to pay for rent, except for upfront. Like you pay a lot of expenses up front instead of like on a regular basis, So that's an interesting dynamic. Again, why I think a lot of college students saying I can't budget because not only do I not have regular income, but I don't have regular expenses either, So how do we deal with that?
Well, I'm thinking about your spending. Yes, you've got those big upfront things that you're paying for when you're in college, but there's also those true expenses, those non-monthlies that are worth considering. Now, there's not going to be as many of them as if you were, have a regular job with that regular income, but if you have a vehicle, right, just setting aside a little bit of money for those oil changes or, the flat tire, gifts, holidays, things like that. Those are all things that are worth setting a little bit of money aside every single month. Again, even if it's just a little bit, so that when they happen, that money's there. Yeah.
And it's interesting, if you're a college student, especially if you're like living on campus and paying like a housing costs, it's kind of like it kind of rolls a lot of expenses into one big expense. Like if I was to live on a dorm, I might pay one bill for the whole semester's food, utilities, rent, basically. I guess you could think of it that way. That's what it is. And so it's almost like taking these things that for most of your life is going to be like a regular monthly expense, and it's almost like treating it like it's making it a big expense. So really, I think Rule 2 is even more important for a college student because those expenses come in larger chunks rather than spread out over time. I'm sure there's like payment plans you can come up with colleges that could do that, but it's just a little different, especially if you're like a traditional college student living on campus.
And I think the key here, though, is just having that plan because that's going to be your guide in deciding whether or not you can afford something. Because if you're looking at that account balance, what you have in your checking account, especially if it's early in the school year, right? It's probably flushed with cash, lots of money sitting there.
Right.
You're always going to be able to justify any sort of purchase.
Right.
But
and then you'd be in trouble later on.
Exactly. And, with those dollars actually have jobs in the future that you want to use them for. And so that's why it's going back to not the account balance, but the budget, right? What do we have available in these spending categories?
And I feel like pushback you might get from college students about having a plan for your money is, hey, I'm in college. There's a lot of opportunities that might pop up for doing something really fun or maybe a learning opportunity. Like there might be things that are going to come up that cost money that you couldn't have expected, but you want to take advantage of it. And people say, I don't want to make a plan because I want to be able to do those things. And I think, this is where Rule 3 comes in again. I think that because you have a plan, you could be more flexible because you'll know, hey, somebody wants to go on a random road trip, right? Like a spur of the moment thing. That's like, I did that kind of thing in college. It's so fun. And I need to know whether I can afford that. Well, if I don't have a plan, it's always going to be a mystery. I'm always going to be afraid that I'm actually spending the money I need for next month's tuition or whatever. But if I have a plan, I can look at it and I can make decisions. Hey, I'm going to pull from here. I'm not going to eat out as much. I'm going to, whatever it is, and make it happen. And then you can go on that spur of the moment trip without fear, and without the guilt or the anxiety. So, yeah, I think actually having a plan, ironically, could make you more spontaneous.
Absolutely.
Because you can do it with confidence.
And take it a step further, even just put a category right there in the budget, put money in that and say, this is for the spontaneous, right?
The spontaneous road trip category, right?
Because honestly, college, at least for me, those were some of the best days of my life, right? I didn't want to go through those days just doing nothing, right? Having no fun.
Yeah. I look back and I think there are opportunities that I passed up that maybe I could have done because I was anxious about money, and maybe I didn't have to be. But I guess I'll never know, honestly, because I didn't have a plan at that time, and I don't know if I could have afforded that.
Well, and there were moments I didn't pass up Yet I was still anxious about money. My friends came to me a week before spring break and said, "You want to go to Georgia with us?" Sure, let's do it. I didn't even think twice. How was I going to pay for it? I don't think that ever crossed my mind. But I know there was some anxiety in there because I was putting everything on that credit card. I was scared of credit card debt and thinking, boy, I hope I'm able to have the money, in the future to pay this off and not pay any interest.
Right. You couldn't, you said yes to the thing, but you couldn't fully enjoy it because you were anxious about money.
Absolutely.
That's no way to live either. So have a plan, even if you think it's going to make you a fuddy-duddy and you're not going to have any fun, have a plan anyway. And I think you'll find that you're going to be even more fun and you're going to have a lot more.
The peace of mind is so worth it.
Yeah, for sure. Let's talk about credit cards because, these credit card companies are always trying to pick off the college students.
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
Did you have that? Like when you went to college, did you have the boots?
Absolutely. And they picked me off. They picked me off like right away. I mean, I remember walking down kind of on the campus mall, and I don't know if it was the free oversized T-shirt that sucked me in or what it was, but they got me. I signed up for a MasterCard, got the T-shirt, and was a MasterCard customer for a very, very long time.
I mean, you get that brand loyalty right off the bat there. That's why they're there,
But yeah, I don't remember what the motivation was. I don't know if it was because I just really wanted that oversized T-shirt or if I wanted to start building my credit. But I just do remember, like I've mentioned already, that fear of, oh, geez, just make sure you don't go into credit card debt.
Yeah. And, we're not like anti-credit cards, I do think there's a little bit of weirdness sometimes in college, like getting a college kid that's maybe a little unaware and giving them a credit card. But if you have a plan and you kind of use that credit card as if it's a debit card where you always have the cash to back up every purchase, it can be a really good thing. It could be good for building credit or any number of things. But you got to be that guy. You got to have that plan,
Yeah. And luckily I didn't go into credit card debt, but the way I handled my credit card wasn't ideal either. So basically what I was doing was just, spending on that card. And then I wasn't setting aside current dollars to pay off that bill. I was just promising my future income, wherever that was coming from, to pay off those things.
Right. Yeah, it can be scary to live that way, and especially when you're in college and you don't have like regular income, it can be even more scary. So, again, having that plan really makes all the difference, I think, when it comes to credit cards, whether you decide to use them or not.
And YNAB makes it so easy to manage those credit cards like a debit card. Right? It's just taking the money that you already have available and just making sure it's there in the budget to send to the credit card company when they come calling for their money.
Yeah. And then it's just another method of payment. It's not so much, it doesn't have all this baggage.
Absolutely.
So you get all the rewards, none of the
and that's what I was getting at. I think I approached credit cards more as a monthly bill than a method of payment. Right.
And that's a good mindset shift. So you can still get the baggy T-shirt, but not the debt. You can go with it, right? So there you go. Be the most expensive baggy T-shirt that you ever had. It could be.
But hey, they were all the rage back then, so it was exactly what I was looking for.
Really cool. I'm sure you looked really cool with your MasterCard shirt in college.
Oh man, I gotta look for a picture.
If we find a picture, we'll put it up. I don't know. You probably won't. But it'll be like it won't even be a digital picture in 1997. You'll have to scan it, right?
I know. Jeez.
There you go.
Well, last big topic that we wanted to talk about here was just, okay, what if you're that person that pays all the bills for your roommates, right? How do you work this out, especially in YNAB? Like, how can you make this actually work? Because these are tricky situations.
It can be. It's emotional. It involves a lot of different people, and the more people you add on, the more complicated it gets. I mean, because I was on the dorm for a couple of years in college, and then I went on to an apartment and had roommates in college, and things got complicated with splitting expenses. And, you always got that one, deadbeat roommate or, well, oh gosh, I don't know. That's a little judgy. I don't know if I want to call him I don't call him a deadbeat. Maybe you got a roommate who's struggling a little bit and is struggling with the bills. It might not necessarily be their fault.
Just forgets to pay back their share. Okay,
you got like legitimately need help affording something, or just a little flaky, right? So how do you handle the flaky roommate, Ernie? Like, what would you do?
How about this? I think the regular workflow is there's the one roommate who just pays for everything, and then they kind of send out, hey, this is what everyone owes me. So there's just that gap between you pay it and when you get that money back.
And if you're the one with the budget, you're going to be that roommate. Probably, everybody's going to look to you to be the leader of the finances in your little household here that you've created with maybe with strangers. And yeah, so in the scenario where one roommate pays and the others pay them back, how would you handle that if you were that person and maybe your roommates weren't paying you back on time all the time? How would you handle it?
Okay, so that gap between when I pay the bill and when I get the money from my roommates, that's stressful for me. Like, just thinking about that, because right, I'm just waiting on that money, thinking, can I cover my other bills? I don't want that stress. So if it were me, and if I was in a financial spot where I could do that, right, I would, with that first month's budget, right, I would pay for that with my own money.
Okay, so you kind of prime the pump a little bit.
Yep. I'm front loading the budget with my own dollars. And so then I know all those bills are covered, right? And I don't need that money to then move forward with my other expenses for the month. So they're covered, and then I just kind of wait, right? I give my roommates a couple weeks, maybe at most a month.
Extra week. Keep texting them, hey.
And then as soon as I get their money, I'm using that to fund the next month's. Right? Okay. Does that make sense?
Okay. So you're always kind of ahead. Instead of being, when you're in that gap between when you pay and when you get paid back, you're not behind. Yeah.
And then on that last month, right, they're paying me back. We're done with school. Good. All right. I have all this money. I can do whatever I want with it at that point.
Maybe. So what if you have a roommate who's like, the 2 weeks turns into 3 weeks, it turns into 4 weeks, turns into 5 weeks, and they haven't paid you back. I think it might, if you want an extra layer of protection, maybe you should have a category that's like flaky roommate category, or like something like that. It's like maybe a mini emergency fund.
Yeah.
We're talking about adding a lot of money to your budget. If you're able to do that, that could add some security, But I do think the front loading thing, especially if you're that person that you're playing that role of almost kind of the landlord among your roommates, that would be a good way to go.
Yeah,
for sure.
But boy, those just never fun situations, right? Once it gets past that month,
it's easier these days though, because you could just like send them a Cash App request like every day or something, like instead of like going and actually having to have that conversation.
It reminds me of a story in college. My roommate's Jeep Wrangler broke down, and he needed a brand new tranny. Didn't have the money for it.
Ooh.
I loved that Jeep Wrangler. I loved the times that we had in that thing. I don't know if that contributed to what I'm about to tell you, but I took out more money from my student loan to loan to my friend, my roommate. So
he could sublet your student loan.
So he could do the car repair.
Oh, that's
but you know what?
It
was horrible when I came calling for that money. Like that, was okay.
I said
worst.
It was nice of you, but maybe it was not a great situation.
Looking back, I should have just given him the money. Right here is a gift to you because constantly trying to get that payback.
It could hurt your relationship.
It was horrible.
Yeah. And luckily, I did not have. I was very blessed to not have any. I had good roommates. Bottom line, that they paid on time, and it wasn't ever really a problem. I did have some situations with some of my friends who I had one friend who literally got an eviction notice in the mail they had been paying their part of the rent, but the person who was responsible for paying the rent was not sending the rent, and they ended up having to foot the bill for a lot of that. So it was, you can get into some tricky situations, and it can be really, really difficult. So, you got to do what you got to do, though.
Well, any parting words of advice here for college students?
Well, if you are a college student watching this, or if you have a college student in your life, any kind of college student, not just, somebody in their 20s, or, if you're in college at all, send us an email, help@ynab.com, with proof of your studenthood, like some kind of, class schedule or a school ID or something like that. And we will give you a free year of YNAB. So definitely take advantage of that.
Great program.
We'll put a link in the description to learn more about that as well.
And Ben, I'm sure we left out some great advice for college students. So we'll let the amazing YNAB community fill in the gaps here in the comments section. Love to hear from you folks.
Yes, please do. Love to hear any other just weird scenarios in that time of life that you can think of that might need a little special attention. Let us know, and maybe we'll talk about it in a future Budget Nerds. But until we do see you again, let's say happy budgeting to everybody. And thanks for listening.
Happy budgeting.
We'll see you all later.